Welcome back. In this lecture, we will discuss one of the key events in human history, England's industrial revolutions, the first ever. We will continue by examining the social consequences of industrialization within societies, its destructive effects on existing social classes, such as artisans, and its exploitation of a new class of industrial laborers and creation of other social classes, the elite bourgeoisie, but also a growing middle class of managers and professionals. We will continue with a discussion of the reaction to the suffering of the working classes and the consequent emergence of a new modern ideology, socialism, which would stand in opposition to classical liberalism and prove as influential in the making of the modern world. Let us begin by noting once again that the Industrial Revolution proved a turning point in the distribution of global wealth and power. Up until around 1800, the world remained multipolar, meaning it had many centers of wealth and power, including ones in Eastern Asia and elsewhere. Yet one mere century later, by 1900, once the full effects of a spreading industrial revolution had been felt, Western Europeans and North Americans had become the center of the world's wealth and power, with Great Britain at the top of the pile due to its early industrialization. Conversely, China and India were now dirt poor, a spectacular reversal for two civilizations long dominant and rich. Thus, by 1900, the world was unipolar, with wealth and power concentrated in Western Europe and in the hands of people of European descent living in North America, South Africa, and Australia. This great divergence in wealth and power between what we now term the rich global North and the poor global South is still with us. Though it should be said in the past 30 years, industrialization in China and India and elsewhere have begun to alter the patterns established after England's Industrial Revolution. As we already know, the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain around 1780 in a rather restricted small area of northwestern England, Lancashire and Cheshire, near the great ports of Liverpool, England's entry point into the slave trade, and then the inland city of Manchester. The Industrial Revolution entailed the use of mechanized devices to mass-produce goods, chiefly textiles and notably cotton, the then cutting-edge product that fueled most economic growth in this early phase of the Industrial Revolution and well into the mid-19th century. In fact, as late as 1850, at the height of the English Industrial Revolution, the cotton economy continued to produce a huge proportion of English gross domestic product, or wealth, about half. Initially, around 1780, the cotton spinning machines drew on water power, which is why the early cotton factories were situated in rural areas or small towns abutting rivers or streams. Later, by the first quarter of the 19th century, James Watt steam engine was adapted and used as a source of power fueled by coal, an abundance of which was available in the English subsoil. Now, because technology and the fuel to power it, coal, were instrumental in the operation of the newly mechanized factories, accounts which seek to explain why was England the first country to industrialize have tended to emphasize the importance of English technical ingenuity, rooted in an earlier scientific revolution, alongside English geologic or geographic luck, namely the wide availability of coal. But as we know, important as English ingenuity and fossil fuels were, they should not obscure enablers of England's 18th century Silicon Valley, as Lancashire and Cheshire are aptly termed by historian Sven Becker. As you well know by now, at this point, war capitalism on the one hand and the long-term effects of the 1688 Glorious Revolution on the other were tremendously important factors as well. Let us now turn to another related question, the relationship between the new industrial form of capitalism invented by the English and its enabler, war capitalism. There tends to be a perception that industrial capitalism and the wage labor associated to it replaced war capitalism and its practices, uncompensated slavery. This view seems to make sense in view of the fact that what was now the center of the world economy, Great Britain, abolished the slave trade by 1807 and then slavery itself in the British Empire by 1833. But in actual fact, war capitalism slavery not only originated and made possible industrial capitalism, but continued to have a major role sustaining it well into the 19th century. The slave trade may have been abolished in the British Empire, but slavery continued to be legal in its former colony, the United States, until the American Civil War of 1861-65. Until then, about 80% of the raw cotton fed into the mechanized factories of Great Britain was actually handpicked by African American slaves in the southern half of the United States. In other words, it was not only the ingenuity of English engineers and businessmen that accounts for the spectacular progress of the English Industrial Revolution into the 19th century, but also the hard and uncompensated labor of Americans. By mid-19th century, England was at the peak of its industrialization, wealth, and power. Aware of the value of their technological and organizational innovations, the English attempted actually to keep their industrial secrets to themselves, but with little success. Industrial espionage, combined with the adoption of freer trade practices under the influence of Adam Smith by the English, resulted by the mid-1850s in the spread of industrialization to parts of France, northern Europe, and then northern Spain and Italy, and then further afield, North America, and the one portion of Eastern Eurasia that industrialized relatively early, Japan, as we will later discuss. Those countries that experienced industrialization early enough soon grew rich and powerful, challenging Great Britain. But the English head start gave it a considerable advantage for a while. In fact, the British Empire would remain the greatest on earth until around 1900. And how did a spreading industrial revolution affect societies and social classes in England and other countries where industries spread? The industrial revolutions that swept across traditional agrarian societies profoundly transformed them and their social structures, creating new social classes, shifting populations from rural areas to urban ones, where increasingly the factories were located, recasting from top to bottom, in other words, societies that for centuries had been centered on agricultural lifestyle. Accompany such changes were also other transformations, too numerous to list entirely, or as poetically described by Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto, with the coming of industrial capitalism, all that is solid is melted into thin air, all that is holy is profaned. The creative destruction of modern capitalism, so feared by pre-modern rulers, had now been thoroughly unleashed by robotic devices operated by low-wage workers and by the capitalists that supplied the funds to build the factories. This meant change, wealth creation, but also great suffering. Mechanization translated, as long predicted, into the massive unemployment of traditional craftsmen. Faced with the mass production of textiles and other goods, artisans could just not compete. Their output, produced manually, was modest, their products too expensive. Distress accompanied their economic decline and that of their families. Poverty and destitution sometimes erupted into open violence, as when the so-called Luddites proceeded to destroy the factory machines and engage in open warfare with the forces of the bourgeois state, which backed the owners of factories. But to no avail. After all, the bourgeoisie controlled the modern industrial state, and therefore its police forces too. While, on the one hand, the new industrial economy created new jobs and opportunities for unemployed land laborers and those former artisans thrown out of work, work conditions were often horrible, negligibly compensated, child labor rampant, and adult wages barely enough to feed families. Ecological, too, devastation accompanied the proliferation of larger and larger industries, now more and more concentrated in squalid, mushrooming industrial cities. Air and water pollution poisoned the lungs and food of industrial workers, whose standard of living actually underwent in many places a steep decline relative to their earlier rural existence. In order to gain a sense of the suffering of the new industrial workers, we will study a famous document, the Sadler Report to the English Parliament of 1832. On the other hand, wage labor also meant cash in the hands of industrial workers. However impoverished, they now increasingly participated as consumers in a growing capitalist economy, using their meager funds to purchase mass-produced products, which they could afford because they were so cheap now. A modern consumer economy was in the making. Countries where industrialization took root became increasingly monetized or cash-based, departure from the nature of traditional pre-modern agrarian societies in which much economic activity had consisted of solely barter and little money circulated. Proliferating industrial plants also led to the growth of recognizably modern corporations with extensive headquarters. And even as exploitation victimized industrial workers, the size of industrial enterprises grew and grew and grew, requiring increasing number of administrators and managers, individuals whose job was to manage workers on the factory floor or company affairs from headquarter offices. These individuals would in time come to be known as white-collar workers and would constitute the core of a growing middle class as opposed to the blue-collar industrial workers. So it's fair to state that the Industrial Revolution also helped create a recognizably modern middle class. Let's end our discussion of the social innovations brought about the Industrial Revolution with the clear winners, the bourgeoisie, the owners of the new factories and other capitalist enterprises. The 19th century marked their triumph, as thanks to the prodigious wealth accumulation achieved, by mid-century the bourgeoisie equaled or surpassed in power and wealth by far the old aristocratic elites of the old feudal pre-modern agrarian order. Newly found economic power now translated into political power. For example, in Great Britain after 1832, the bourgeoisie, after a campaign of petitioning to Parliament, was awarded the right to vote, at long last expanding the qualified electorate beyond the original 2% allowed by the Glorious Revolution. Let's now tackle our final theme today, the emergence of a new ideology for the industrial age which would challenge classical liberalism. In other words, socialism. As we've seen, for all the wealth creation associated with the triumph of the bourgeoisie and industrial capitalism, it was apparent as early as the first quarter of the 19th century that industrialization had not only displaced traditional artisanal workers, but also created great hardship among the very industrial workers that it employed. Such negative outcomes had not been predicted by the dominant ideology of the modern age, and in particular its economic incarnation, Adam Smith's economic version of classical liberalism. Adam Smith had praised mechanization, technological innovation, free trade, and the creative destruction of capitalism. Smith had earlier held that, provided the free market was allowed to do its thing without undue government intervention, a rosy future was certainly in the making for all members of society, not just the bosses, but also the workers, he claimed. Well, by the 19th century, Adam Smith's optimistic Enlightenment era classical economic liberalism, while increasingly popular among the bourgeoisie, appeared to other members of society to be shallow and wildly off course, a mere fig leaf justifying the exploitation of working people. Critics now proliferated increasingly among the emerging educated middle classes and, of course, the working class itself. And the result of their critique of economic liberalism would be this new ideology we will now discuss, socialism. We should really talk about socialism in the plural as a series of socialisms, because there were many currents of this 19th century ideology or system of ideas. The three principal ones that emerged in rough chronological order over the course of the 19th century were: number one, utopian socialism; number two, Marxist or revolutionary socialism; and then number three, evolutionary or reform socialism towards the end of the century. Today, we will briefly mention utopian socialism and then focus primarily on Marxist or revolutionary socialism. We will take a look at evolutionary reform socialism, the third form of socialism, which emerges towards the end of the century when we discuss nationalism in a later class. Now, utopian socialists, such as the unusually philanthropic factory owner Robert Owen illustrated above, believed that industrial capitalism could be improved by helping the lot of industrial workers. This could be done, he argued, by creating self-contained and self-managed communities of workers provided with housing, given limited working hours and better working conditions. Ultimately, Owen and other utopian socialists failed to have a huge impact, as their proposed experiments with ideal factory town communities were not widely imitated and tended to remain isolated experiments. Whatever the good intentions of some factory owners such as Owen, most bourgeois capitalists stuck to their profit-driven policies of exploiting as much as possible their workers. Still, utopian socialism had a pioneering role in the early 19th century, questioning free market classical economics, as well as bequeathing ideas that would be recycled in the future. For example, the 8-hour workday or the condemnation of child labor. More impactful than utopian socialism would prove Marxist or revolutionary socialism, our main topic. At some level, like other socialists, Karl Marx, a German living in the Kingdom of Prussia, which was then rapidly industrializing, supported the Enlightenment belief in progress and the rights of man. But among the Enlightenment rights he most treasured was the belief that all humans have a right to real economic equality. This human right was, as we've seen, an undercurrent of Enlightenment thought, once aired by Rousseau in his essay on the origins of inequality and its denunciation of private property as supposedly the origin of all the ills of civil society. Overall, however, during the 18th century, the ideal of economic equality had remained a minor theme, one obscured by the Enlightenment goals of more basic human rights, such as the right to political liberty and freedom from feudalism and slavery, or the collective right of a people to self-government. In Karl Marx's eyes, the bitter fruits of industrialization totally discredited the kind of mainstream Enlightenment classical liberalism upheld by John Locke or Adam Smith. Adam Smith's predictions, Marx argued, were wrong. Actually, if left to its own devices, industrial capitalism would over time produce lower and lower wages for factory workers, whose numbers would grow in turn to create a huge, underpaid, discontented proletariat. The middle classes, he said, would disappear. And by the same token, contrary to Smith's belief that more untrammeled capitalism would produce a multiplicity of highly competitive industrial companies, Marx believed that industrial capitalism would actually produce a new form of monopoly capitalism controlled by private interests. In other words, the bourgeoisie and their companies and corporations would increase in wealth and control of the economy, but decrease in numbers, as the more successful corporations bought out others after each successive economic crisis of overproduction, which Marx also argued was a quintessential trait of industrial capitalism. Marx, in other words, was very pessimistic when it came to the future of industrial capitalism and the bourgeoisie. By its very nature, it would inevitably produce its own destruction, its own gravediggers, as he put it. The rich would become richer, the poor poorer, and in the final analysis, a desperately underpaid proletariat would destroy the ruling bourgeoisie in a final violent conflagration he termed the Great Proletarian Revolution. And what would happen, argued Marx, after the Great Proletarian Revolution? He envisioned two phases. A first one, he believed, would be a socialist transitional one, during which the proletariat, having taken over the means of production, in other words, factories and farms, and as well as taken over the formerly bourgeois state, would ensure their wages and institute a number of progressive measures such as free education, progressive taxation, childcare, healthcare, etc. Once socialism had been consolidated, argued Marx, true communism would follow, during which he predicted the state would actually disappear, money cease to be necessary, and distinct social classes also vanish, replaced by one single class, constituted by workers. Marx's revolutionary socialism would prove highly influential both intellectually, but also in practice, actually, inspiring workers' insurrections and movements across Europe in the second half of the 19th century. None of these insurrections in the 19th century, however, would prove successful in durably overturning the bourgeois order. when the great proletarian revolution actually came, it would actually occur not in an advanced industrial nation, as Marx had predicted, but rather in a still largely agrarian society, the Russian Empire of 1917. The Russian Workers' Revolution of 1917 would in turn produce the world's first socialist state, the Soviet Union, officially established by 1922. The Soviet Union would call itself socialist, but hoped to reach Marx's ultimate stage of socialism, which we have seen as communism. We therefore describe the Soviet Union as communist due to this aspiration. So, in conclusion, the Industrial Revolution greatly enriched the countries that first experienced it, leading to a massive redistribution of global wealth and power known as the Great Divergence. Also, the industrialization profoundly transformed those societies that experienced it, creating new social classes, new opportunities for some, but also new forms of exploitation of other social classes. And finally, the Industrial Revolution's consequences included the emergence of a new ideology, socialism, which disputed the optimism, equity, and fairness of classical liberalism, and would lead to the creation of new forms of government in the future, including 20th century communist states.